Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 9th webinar in Conn-Maciel Carey's OSHA webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing lessons learned from OSHA's updated walking working surfaces rule, a rule that was published back in November 2016. So we're going to be going through some of those updates, what we've learned, and provide you some enforcement statistics. My name is Deacon, and I'll introduce myself here in a second further, but I'm joined today by my colleague Micah Smith. I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Micah Smith, and I'm a partner with Conn-Maciel's OSHA Workplace Safety Group. We provide the full range of services for all your OSHA matters, litigation and counseling. We handle inspections, investigations, catastrophic incidents, and the like. We also offer counseling, ideally helping you to resolve your workplace safety issues before there's a problem, inspection, or injury. So I've had the good fortune to cover a wide range of industries, and this recent update to the Walking Working Surfaces Standard has provided a good opportunity to dig into a new realm. So we're looking forward to covering this in detail. Dan?
Thanks, Micah. And my name is Deacon. Again, I'm an associate here at Conn-Maciel Carey in both the OSHA and labor and employment groups. I represent employers during inspections and investigations conducted by both federal and state OSHA. I advise and counsel employers in responding to notices of employee safety complaints and general OSHA citations. And on the labor and employment side, I represent and advise employers in all aspects of the employer-employee relationship and assist employers with reviewing and revising handbooks and developing workplace policies and procedures. So I'm going to kick it off here with just a brief background of the agenda and the plan of action for today's webinar. First, we're going to discuss a little bit of the background of the Walking Working Surfaces Rule, followed by some of the new revisions. Mike is then going to cover some enforcement statistics from fiscal year 2017, and then we're going to end with some other notable issues and some information about guidance and interpretation letters. So to start, the Walking Working Surfaces Standard has been among the most frequently cited standards by OSHA. And Mike, as I mentioned, he's going to give you a recap in a few slides of those most frequently cited standards for fiscal year 2017. The data for fiscal year 2018 should actually be coming out within a month. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll be providing those statistics on our blog. However, the overwhelming majority of general industry accidents actually stem from slips, trips, and falls. Approximately 15% of accidental deaths occur from slips, trips, and falls, and that's about 345 deaths a year. Approximately 20% of workplace fatalities, disabling injuries, and days away injuries in the general industry setting result from slips, trips, and falls as well, and that accounts for approximately 200,000 injuries alone. So from an employer point of view, there's a number of downfalls related to slips, trips, and falls, and making sure, stressing why it's important to maintain safe walking working surfaces. With those 200,000 injuries that result in lost work time per year, that's a pretty big hit to productivity. And these types of incidents also, result in increased insurance premiums, workers' comp claims, and you also got to think about replacing employees, training employees or temps. The OSHA piece, add that to it, the investigations, citations, and finally it can cost employers contract opportunities, especially if your workplace safety and health record is viewed as poor. So as you're aware, the prior Walking Working Surfaces Rule is substantially different, and we're here to tell you, that some of those differences and try and bring some levity to your concerns. But Subpart D of the General Industry Standards was adopted in April 1971, so we're talking about, almost 50 years ago. The primary protection in that original standard was guardrails and barriers. That was the primary concern. The 1984 Compliance Directive, the use of personal fall arrest systems was permissible when workers were exposed to falls of 4 or more feet if the situation did not occur on a predictable and regular basis. So what was a predictable and regular basis? Well, that meant employee functions such as inspections, service, repair, and maintenance performed at least once every 2 weeks, every other week, or a total of at least 4 man-hours during any sequential 4-week period. So one of the benefits that the new walking working surfaces standard brings is that it's more consistent with the construction standard, fall protection standard, that is. Sorry, the new rule increases consistency between the general industry and construction standards, but it doesn't change those threshold applications. So as you see on the screen here, we have the general industry threshold is still 4 feet or greater. Maritime is 5 feet or greater. Construction, 6 feet, and steel erection, 15 feet or greater. The new standard does, however, replace a lot of those machine-specific standards that required different thresholds. So now you just have one standard threshold that applies for all of these industries, the ones that you see here on the screen. So it's going to make it easier for those who perform in a number of those different industries. There's a lot of employers that are engaging in general industry activities, but also construction activities. So for all intents and purposes, the application of the standard is going to be generally similar, but those thresholds when fall protection is required still remains different. So on this slide, I'm just going to go over the general history of attempting to update this standard. And it was a long time coming. It took over 25 years, basically. So here, the first notice of proposed rulemaking and the public hearing to debate the rule occurred back in 1990. The rule didn't progress past this stage, though, until 2003, so 13 years later. That's when the record was reopened to address comments and hold another hearing. Again, closed for a substantial period of time, 7 years, until 2010, when a second notice of proposed rulemaking was issued to reflect the current information, better technology, and the demands to increase consistency between general industry and the construction standards. So comments were received and the hearings were held throughout 2011, and then another substantial period of nothing, silence, 5 years. And then finally the rule was cleared by OMB and OIRA, and it was published in November of 2016. The effective date of the rule, as you can see on the last bullet here, was January 17th, 2017. So as I mentioned, it took over 25 years to complete. A lot of thought went into it. There's about 500 pages in the preamble alone, located in the Federal Register, so it is pretty burdensome to get through that. It's pretty substantial amount of information, and there was some notable changes. And that's where we're going to head now, is what are those revisions to the rule, and how has the rule changed? So this slide shows you on the left the new framework of the Walking Working Surfaces Standard, and on the right, that was the old Walking Working Surfaces Rule. So the side-by-side comparison here, OSHA actually included this in the notice of proposed rulemaking, and from my perspective, it's certainly been helpful over the past few years, matching up different standards, and it's also helpful in finding old guidance, because some of the old guidance still has the old regulations, the numbers. So as you can see, there's a couple new provisions here, 1928, 29, and 30. Those are pretty much all new. The safety requirements for scaffolding, manually propelled mobile ladder standards and scaffolds, and other walking working surfaces. And finally, there's two non-mandatory appendices, Appendix C and Appendix D. Those are related to planning, selecting, and using personal fall arrest systems and test methods and procedures for those fall arrest systems. So although they're non-mandatory, they are certainly helpful and worth reviewing. So here we're going to go over the effects of the new rule. One of the best things this rule does is that it adds consistency between the general industry and construction standards, and you've heard me say that a number of times now, but it makes compliance and implementation of this rule for many employers a lot easier. Other walking working surfaces standards have been updated since their inception, since they were originally promulgated, including the construction standards. So there was a lot of divergence and discrepancies between the general industry standard and others. After all, it did take over 45 years for this to be published and final. So one other thing that it did, in addition to making it consistent with the other standards in OSHA's book, it also made it more consistent with the current national consensus standards. When it was originally written, the rule was based on a pre-1971 ANSI standard. You have to know that there's going to be updates to those standards and technology is changing, but unfortunately OSHA didn't move as quickly. So another good thing that the standard provides is flexibility. There's many new parts to the rule that are more like specification standards, but there's several other areas that have changed where it's more of a performance-based standard. So there's more room for employers to have a choice in how they're complying with the standard. So here's a couple other notable revisions, and we're going to go over a couple of these in the next few slides. One of the most significant revisions is they got rid of specific definitions, and there's more unified definitions throughout the standard. Previously, when you went to the prior definition section in 1910-21, there were a lot of duplicate definitions, and it was much easier to get confused. Now we have these unified definitions, and it makes things a lot simpler. So we actually went from 125 definitions in the prior rule to 65 definitions. So that's almost cutting the definitions in half, right? It also eliminated overly specific application conditions. So some of the old rules, for example, on keeping aisles clear, they had strange applications at the beginning of them, such as where mechanical handling equipment is used, aisleways and passageways should be kept clear. In applying those rules, OSHA basically started applying them to all workplaces, as opposed to workplaces where mechanical handling equipment was used. So now they've gotten rid of those application specific conditions, and it's more general, it's broad. Here are some other more simple general requirements that we're going to go over in a little bit of detail here. Housekeeping, load limits, aisles and passageways, and the inspection requirement. So with regards to housekeeping, this is actually one of the most frequently cited standards, frequently cited violations in Subpart D. So generally, workplaces must be kept clean, orderly, and sanitary. Every floor, working place, and passageway needs to be kept free of protruding nails, splinters, holes, loose boards, and generally free of hazards, anything. Load limits. Employers need to ensure that each walking working surfaces can support the maximum intended load for the surface. There's no, this is one key piece, there's no more requirement to have a placard or a sign indicating the maximum load, however. That was done away with in the final rule. Engineers already go through that in developing the designs for buildings. So There's no concern about posting a sign about maximum intended loads, and that specification requirement is deleted. With regards to aisles and passageways, employers need to provide and ensure employees have a safe means of access and egress to and from walking working surfaces. And this revision makes sure that it applies to all walking working surfaces, which is defined as any horizontal or vertical surface on or through which an employee walks, works, or gains access to a workplace location. So this is an example of making that broader definition of walking working surfaces, and the application-specific conditions, they're nowhere to be seen. This is just a very broad application for the aisles and passageways, and that's how it is. Finally, we'll talk a little bit here about the inspection requirement. At the 1910-22D, employers must inspect and maintain walking working surfaces in a safe condition. And this is a general requirement for regular inspections of walking working surfaces, and this is mainly to make it more consistent with the construction standard. This was already a requirement in 1926. So paragraph D1 requires that employers inspect and maintain walking working surfaces in a safe condition, and OSHA's primary belief here is that inspecting these surfaces is necessary to ensure that they're maintained, and you basically need to do these inspections regularly and as necessary. So the term regular inspection here, a lot of employers have questions about, what is this inspection requirement? How often do we have to do it? Well, the term regular inspection means that employers have some type of schedule, whether it's formal or informal, for inspecting the walking working surfaces in the workplace. And it simply needs to be adequate enough to identify the hazards and address them in a timely manner. So in addition to those regular inspections, again, I mentioned you have to conduct them as necessary. And for purposes of this requirement, inspecting as necessary means that the employer needs to conduct inspections when the circumstances warrant it, basically. So if you see something or hear that there's a mess in the workplace, you have a duty to go and inspect that. And I'm going to turn it over to Micah now, and he's going to go over some of the revisions with ladders and some other changes.
All right, so continuing the theme of simplification and better organization, we see the same kind of thing here in the ladders section. We have, before there were three different sections that dealt with ladders. You had a separate part for fixed ladders, one for wood ladders, one for metal portable ladders. Here we throw everything together into one standard. There are still some separate requirements, but there's a large chunk of common requirements. So much easier to read and to deal with. You can find everything that you want in one place, so that's a big improvement. Just a quick run through what's there in 1910-23. As I said, there's some general requirements for construction and use. Focus there is on things like rung spacing and width. There is a requirement to do inspections, much like there is generally now. For portable ladders, there are a few things that apply only to metal or wood, and some usage requirements as well. Fixed ladders is another big section here. We have listed there some of the aspects that are regulated. And then the last piece, OSHA threw in mobile ladder stands and platforms here to keep everything consistent. And, when you look at the old standards versus the new standards, right, we've highlighted there's better organization. There are some small differences in the requirements. One example is rung spacing. Before I believe for spacing on ladder rungs, it was a maximum of 12 inches. And with an apparent ability to go as short as you wanted to, now the window is between 10 and 16 inches. So you may have some, if you have people that were used to the old rule of never more than 12 inches spacing between rungs, you now have some more flexibility, but you also now have a minimum distance that you may have to deal with. So keep an eye on those minor differences. You or someone on your team should probably keep an eye on this and make sure you're tracking those changes there and making sure that whatever your walking working surfaces program said before, it matches with the new standards now. So moving on, one of the biggest changes in the ladder arena is to fall protections. This is the thing that everyone's been watching. Moving forward, OSHA has made it clear that they are moving away from the more fixed fall protection of cages and wells and moving to a general requirement for personal fall protection or ladder safety systems. So this matches with some of their other moves to provide some flexibility, but also a recognition that these personal safety systems are more effective in protecting employees. Cages and wells are very useful when you're climbing a ladder and you want to take a break or make sure you don't get overly tired on the way up, but they're not as effective at preventing injury if there is a fall. So with this change, OSHA was fairly considerate in allowing some time for everyone to digest these changes and to make sure you come into compliance. So we've got lined out here the time sequence for effectiveness here. There are some grandfathering provisions here and some phase-in. So the rule was finalized in early 2017. Now we're nearly 2 years later. We are nearing the first deadline here for these fixed ladders. So by November the 19th, 2018, you need to make sure that any ladder above 24 feet is equipped with personal fall arrest system, a ladder safety system, a cage, or a well. Now, you remember I just said that we're moving away from fixed fall protection like cages and wells. What's going on here? Well, this is consider November the 19th, 2018 to be the close of the period when you can install or when you can rely on cages or wells as your fall protection for ladders over 24 feet. So you have about 2 more months to lock these things in, get those things installed if you want them, and if you want to be able to rely on them for a significant period of time. After November the 19th of this year, any time that you install or significantly modify or replace a fixed ladder that's over 24 feet, you need to be installing a personal fall arrest system or a ladder safety system. There's some debate about what is meant by a significant modification. We won't go into the details here, but you can be sure that if you have a new ladder or a full replacement that you need to go ahead and make that switch. So that will be the reigning rule for 18 years up through 2036. And then your next deadline, November the 18th, 2036, all fixed ladders over 24 feet need to be equipped with personal fall arrest systems or ladder safety system. So this allows you nearly 20 years to make that change. You can budget for that in your capital expenditures. Keep an eye on it. I've talked to many people who check their calendars real quick and have seen that this isn't exactly their problem, but make sure whoever succeeds you in your safety role, make sure that they know that 2036 is coming and plans need to be made for making this switch. All right. In connection there, we mentioned earlier that one of the big moves here was to allow more flexibility when it comes to fall protection. I think this is one of the major benefits of this change in rules. Before, everything was guardrails, cages or wells on ladders. That's really what was defined because there were not the very sophisticated personal fall protection systems that exist now back when the rule was promulgated in the early 70s. So with this change, the change in technology, OSHA has acknowledged that there are many different solutions for a particular problem, and so you are allowed a number of different options when you're addressing fall protection. I would highlight that when you're evaluating what fall protection to use, you should take a good look at 1910-28. That is the section that identifies the fall protection that is required or allowed for a number of different situations. We'll talk about some of those when we get to the enforcement slides in a minute. But your options are not the same for every different situation. So if you're facing just a regular open side or edge, your options are going to be different than if you are above, let's say, dangerous machinery or a low slope roof. You are going to have more options in some places, fewer options in others. OSHA has done a pretty decent job of allowing some flexibility based on those special circumstances. It can be a lot to try to deal with to try to comprehend all of the different situations. So it's important to make sure that you're tracking. You've checked to see if there is a special requirement for certain situations that are listed there in 1910-28. The last thing to highlight here is with the move from toward personal fall arrest systems, OSHA has been clear that these systems do not include the use of body belts. They can be used instead of harnesses when they're part of a ladder safety system, but what we saw years ago where the body belt was the primary method when using a personal fall arrest system, we've now moved on. You see harnesses a lot more often. There's some significant safety advantages there. All right, we want to flag residential roofs real quick here because it shows some of the flexibility that's offered. OSHA has acknowledged, thankfully, that when you're working on a residential roof, this is not your typical work site. I suspect that most of us don't have people working on our roofs daily or weekly or monthly. When you have something done, you have somebody up there for a short period of time, and you don't have the goal, or you don't have the incentives to install fixed guardrails or things like that. You also have a lot of different possible configurations just based on the style of your house or what you have up on top. So what this section does is it acknowledges that there are a wide variety of roofs out there, and it creates this flexibility that if the employer can demonstrate that using guardrails, safety nets, or personal fall protection system on your residential roof is infeasible or would create a greater hazard, you have the option of implementing a fall protection plan that meets the requirements of 502K in the construction standards and then providing training accordingly. We won't go into the details of what's required there, but we'll just flag here that there is this flexibility here. If you're thinking of using a fall protection plan instead of some kind of fixed fall protection, you should be cautious. Make sure that it really is infeasible or creates a greater hazard, not just that it is somewhat difficult. The analysis of whether something is infeasible will depend in part on what technology is available. So it may be that 10 years ago there wasn't a product that would provide personal fall protection on this particular roof, but in the last 10 years something has become widely available and not terribly expensive. The OSHA compliance officers are likely to be up on that. They're following some of the trends on what's available. They've seen people on other work sites using fall protection, and so they will have a pretty good frame of reference on feasibility in some of these cases. So do use some caution if you're thinking about concluding that your fixed protection or personal fall protection is infeasible. Falling object protection, there's a lot more flexibility here as well. Before we saw a lot of focus on toe boards. Now we see a little more flexibility allowing toe board screens, canopy structures, or just barricading the area and prohibiting workers from entering the area where objects might fall. There's also been some movement in terms of technology on the use of tethers. This is something we expect OSHA to be issuing some interpretations on possibly in the future. It's another option. It didn't get addressed very clearly in the standard, but using tethered tools is another way to prevent falling objects. Of course, don't forget that falling objects don't just include the tools that you're using up there. It might also include the hard hat that your workers are wearing up there on that upper level. So if you are considering using a tethering option, you'll need to be very thorough in getting everything. One small but important change here in 28C is the requirement for toe board height. If you recall, in the previous version, the minimum height of your toe board was 4 inches. It may come as a surprise to some of you that a 2x4 is actually not 4 inches wide. It's more like 3.5 inches wide. And so people who bought 2x4s to use as toe boards ran into the problem that their 2x4 was not 4 inches high. They were in violation of the rules technically. OSHA has addressed that here and said, okay, we'll acknowledge the reality of standardized lumber sizes and move that requirement down to 3.5 inches. We won't spend too much time on scaffolds and rope descent systems. The big note here on scaffolds is the lack of general industry specific provisions. OSHA just threw in the towel when it came to rewriting the scaffold provisions for general industry and said, look, we've got good and very detailed requirements in the construction standards, and we are just going to reference those directly. So if you look in 1910-27, you're not going to find specific requirements for those scaffolds. You are going to get referred over to 1926, the 500 series, I think, to find your requirements there. So make sure you make that jump when you're looking for your requirements for scaffolds. The big new addition for 1910-27 was rope descent systems, whereas this had previously been addressed by general industry citations. OSHA was regulating on a more ad hoc basis. They provided some more specific requirements here, codified their 91 memo that allowed the use of these rope descent systems, and they also added a 300-foot height limit for their use. That is the subject of some litigation, which we'll cover a little bit later. The last bullet here flags one particular requirement that people have struggled with a little bit, the requirement that building owners have to affirm that permanent anchorages have been tested, certified, and maintained. That's turned out to be a little thornier than many people expected in terms of getting the right kind of people out there who could do these inspections and the certifications. So we've got an interpretation that we'll highlight on that a little later in the presentation. Quick note to the outdoor advertising and qualified climbers realm. Previously, there was a 1993 exception for outdoor advertising or the billboard industry that would allow people to use qualified climbers instead of using fall protection. In the years since that exception was made, there were a number of falls and at least one fatality in that industry. What we see here is a recognition from OSHA that was not as an effective protection for workers as they would have liked, and so phasing that out, they are moving back toward requiring fixed ladder fall protection, the same as you see in the regular general industry context. All right, the last new requirement here was employer training requirements. Here we saw OSHA codify what I think everyone had assumed was needed, that you train people on some of these fall protection issues. There's some specification for who needs to be trained. It's not everyone in your workforce, but it does include those people who work in areas where they may face a fall and those that use personal fall protection. So you need to make sure you have a qualified person doing this. There's no requirement for a specific certification. You can qualify someone based on experience or on training. But when they're doing that training, you need to make sure that they are training on how to identify and minimize fall hazards, how to use fall protection systems and any other equipment that you are having them use, like rope descent systems. And then, of course, the procedures to maintain, inspect, and store your fall protection equipment. So it's not, this one isn't rocket science, but you do, because this is a new requirement, we're trying to help everyone make sure that they include in their training program these essential elements. It's simple, but these are important things to make sure you have all of them. All right, moving on to enforcement. This has been a pretty interesting area for us to try to watch. I will caution you that this information is not complete, because the new rules became effective in January of 2018. It caused a bit of a conflict with OSHA's annual reporting of their citations. The government's fiscal year runs from October 1st through September the 30th, and so the numbers we're using here are for fiscal year 17, which is to say October of 2016 through September of 2017. Which means that we had 3.5 months under the old rules, which didn't have the same numbers and subparts, and we have 8.5 months using the new rules. So when OSHA reports out that they had 100 citations under 1910-23C1, what you're up against is seeing that before that meant that was a requirement that you have guardrails on an open side or edge. Now it's a requirement related to ladder construction. So for some areas, we're just unable to parse exactly when in the year these citations were issued. We just have a number of citations that were issued over the course of a year. So for some of these things, we can't separate those and tell you, okay, this looks like those ladders were really getting cited, as opposed to, wow, this was really focused on unguarded edges. So what we have here in these slides are those sections that either stayed the same. So a good example here is the first one for the general housekeeping. They changed the words a little bit, but the effect of this section 1910-22A1 is really the same, and so it's easy to track how frequently this one was cited. So there are some gaps here. There are some things that aren't addressed because we just couldn't separate them out. But I will say that going through the numbers of citations, we do have the biggest groups. So in those things that we couldn't separate out, you didn't see numbers in the 200s or even, I think, in the hundreds. What you've got here really are the most frequently cited sections. All right, so we've got the top 8 here. What do we see? Well, if you look for patterns and trends, what you should see really quickly is that 1910-22A, A1, A2, and A3 has the number 1, 3, and 5 place here, right? So if you take those general requirements for having a general housekeeping, keeping your workspaces or work floors clean and dry, and keeping your walking working surfaces free of hazards, that gives you already over 400 citations, with more than 450, I think. So the number one issue that OSHA inspectors are seeing and citing in your workplace related to walking working surfaces is going to be keeping those floors and those surfaces clean, dry, and free of hazards. So that is absolutely and unequivocally the number one issue that we've seen in walking working surfaces. All right, moving past that, what do we see? The next thing that we see a lot of are these citations under 1910-28B, some subsection, right? So remember earlier I said that 1910-28 includes the requirements for what your fall protection has to be in certain situations. Well, you see here in the number 2 spot, the 4 spot, 6 and 8, different subparts addressed here. So we've got fall protection for unprotected sides and edges. That's the general requirement that applies most frequently. You've got fall protection for stairways, for holes, and around dangerous equipment. So that takes the next biggest chunk of these citations. So you've got some unguarded sides around different pieces of equipment or different configurations. That's where you see a lot more of the citations. The only other section here that doesn't fit into those first two categories here is this 7th citation. It was a little difficult to parse some of these out because there was some overlap with the previous version of the standard. But this 1910 29B section, the subparts under there, this is the specifications for guardrail systems. This covers your guardrail height, your strength, and things along those lines. There's a significant number of citations issued under these provisions, so that rounds up the top 8. So if you're wondering what OSHA is going to look at when they come out to your facility, focus on 3 things when it comes to walking working surfaces. Keeping things clean, dry, and free of hazards. That's the first one. Second one is watching your fall protection that's provided around areas where there's a drop-off of 4 feet or more. And the last one is making sure that your fixed guardrails and other fall protection meets the specifications that are outlined in 1910-29. All right, that gives you a sense of what are the top issues. We included here just a run of some of the other things that we saw, just trying to look for some other trends, seeing what OSHA is looking at and sometimes not looking at. You see right here the top 3, what we just discussed, those general requirements, a lot of citations there. We included here the 4th slide here with 18 citations under 1910-22B. This is under maximum intended load. If you remember, Dan highlighted the fact that you are no longer required to have a placard in place. That was a gimme citation in many inspections that we saw. Well, you don't have that requirement to have the placard anymore, but OSHA is still checking into what is the maximum intended load and have employers exceeded that. So even though you're not required to have those placards anymore, don't think that you're not going to get questions about what is the maximum intended load for certain areas. So keep an eye on that.
And just to piggyback off that, OSHA did issue an interpretation letter stating, although the placard isn't required anymore, employers still need to ensure that employees involved in warehousing or storage activities, that they know the intended load limits of those areas. But if we're talking just simply a floor or something like that, the engineering plans should suffice for that, and employers should have sufficient knowledge of what those load limits are.
Yeah, and that's a good clarification, because I think, and this is anecdotal, but what we've seen, those load limit citations tend to be related to warehousing or other things for storage. It is much less frequent that you get someone asking, what is your maximum intended load for a runway or a catwalk in your facility? That's not to say that you never get questions on it, but it's a lot less frequent. It probably would require the compliance officer to walk up there and think it looks a little rickety, or maybe have an employee complaint that maybe it's not built to withstand the load that it's being subjected to. So definitely have a heightened level of attention if you're in warehousing or doing other storage for that section there. We have here the reference to 1910-24, step bolts and manhole steps. No citations at all here. I know these aren't particularly as common equipment as many other things here, but so far no enforcement there under that provision. We have a couple entries here under 1910-25, subpart B. This relates to stairways, to handrails, stair rails, and then also to the riser height and tread depth. So these compliance officers are out there with their tape measures checking into these things. As we said before, you should have your local safety people out there making sure that they're familiar with what are the new requirements, because they are somewhat different, often a matter of inches. But make sure that they're on board with what exists out there. Also that they know when these pieces of equipment were constructed, because that, as we'll cover in a minute, can give you some protection in a grandfathering sense. Last one here on the slide, 1910-27A. Remember earlier we said that no longer is there a general industry scaffold requirement. It just references you to the construction section. Well, here we see 11 citations that were issued under the provision that references those construction scaffold requirements. So inspectors are out there. They are doing this cross-reference. So if you haven't checked into those requirements for scaffolding construction and you're in the general industry context, go ahead and do that, because they are holding people accountable for those things. All right, last thing here on enforcement, what we included here are the fall protection citations. So here are the different parts of 1910-28B where there are special requirements for different situations. You can see the range of citations that have been issued here. The top here is the general requirement for unprotected sides and edges generically. A couple hundred of these have been issued, all the way down to the fall protection requirements on scaffolds and rope descent systems. We only see 2 citations having been issued there. There is certainly a correlation between the frequency that compliance officers see these situations and the frequency of the citations, right? You see much higher numbers for holes and for stairways. But you know, you should take a look at this. Keep an eye on what you've got out there in the field. There's a number of citations here for work on low slope roofs. This may be related. I tend to think it's not related to the fact that there is a tremendous amount of work happening on low slope roofs. It's probably related to the change in how this is being addressed. People were a little too willing and not paying attention to the new requirements, just using notification systems or flags. There are some areas and some uses or some work activities on low slope roofs where you don't have to implement actual fall protection, but you've got to keep a close eye on what your work areas are there. So keep an eye on those things. And with that, we'll move on to other notable issues, and I'll pass it back to Dan.
Thanks, Micah. Yep, so we're going to kick it off here with some other notable issues, followed by the guidance and interpretation. This is the tail end of our presentation, and we only have a couple slides left here, so we'll try and keep this as close as we can to the allotted time. First, we're going to begin with, I should first start with this slide. The topics that we're going to cover here are rolling stock and motor vehicles, agriculture operations, the rollout and effective deadlines, some of those grandfather provisions, and then some updates on the legal challenges. So first, starting with rolling stock. During the rulemaking, OSHA had requested input from industry about whether fall protection for rolling stock and motor vehicles should be adopted, and ultimately it wasn't. The preamble specifically carved out this exclusion, stating this final rule does not include any specific requirements for fall protection on rolling stock and motor vehicles, and OSHA's current existing enforcement policies on rolling stock and motor vehicles remain in effect. So OSHA defines rolling stock as any locomotive, rail car, or vehicle operated exclusively on a rail or rails or a trolley bus operated by electric power. Motor vehicle, on the other hand, means any commercial bus, van, or truck, including tractor-trailers, flatbeds, tankers, and hopper trucks. So it's important to keep in mind that OSHA does not have jurisdiction over motor vehicles on highways or rail cars. That's going to be the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the Federal Railroad Administration. So those are going to be governed by the Department of Transportation regulation. So continuing on to the current guidance on rolling stock, what is that? So in recent years, what we've seen is the agency attempting to exert itself by citing employers for lack of fall protection on on these rolling stock, but we have to go back to the 1996 enforcement memo, and that is what remains as a standard for providing fall protection on rolling stock. And there it said OSHA will not cite employers for violations of fall protection standards for work on top of rolling stock unless stock is positioned next to a structure where the installation of fall protection is feasible. So generally the question of what is feasible now has become more and more loose, I guess you could say, but it's also, with the change in technology, become more feasible to provide these types of fall protection. So although the current enforcement guidance states that you won't be cited under any of the fall protection standards, we have seen OSHA cite employers under the general duty clause. So in terms of, writing this off as something that you don't need to be concerned about and that OSHA is simply following this 1996 enforcement memo, that's not necessarily the case. There are area offices out there that are issuing citations for rolling stock and lack of fall protection, and it's something that you should definitely evaluate if you have these in your workplace. Next here, we're going to be covering agriculture operations, and I'll go over this one really quick. So agricultural operations generally are not covered by the rule. So what does that include? That includes activities in growing and harvesting and raising livestock, the preparation of the ground, sowing, watering, weeding, spraying, harvesting livestock, and all the activities necessary for those activities. What is not covered by the rule, but that is somewhat associated with agriculture activities, let me back that up. What is covered by the rule? What type of activities are covered by the rule? Well, that's on the bottom half of the screen here. Grain handling, food process operations, any manufacturing operations at your facility, post-farm activities such as receiving, sorting, cleaning, weighing, inspecting, and packing and shipping those materials, and then the processing of agricultural products that changes character, such as canning. And now I'm just going to turn it over to Micah. He's going to go over some of the effective dates and the rollout of the ladders, some of which we've gone over already.
Yeah, so we've covered everything here related to ladders already, which is most of the rollout here. Just want to highlight some of these other deadlines. So the deadline to train those workers who may be exposed to fall hazards was May of last year. So if you haven't taken care of that yet, now is a fantastic time to go ahead and do that. So that training is both related to the fall hazards of their jobs and then also how to use fall protection equipment that is covered by this rule. Talked a little bit earlier about those permanent anchorages for rope descent systems. The deadline for inspecting and certifying those was November of last year. We've got the note here that there's been an enforcement guidance issued on this topic. I'll go ahead and address it here rather than saving it for the other slide. Because there was a significant demand for inspecting and certifying these anchorages, OSHA was hearing from employers or building owners that they were not able to get inspectors out to get these certifications and inspections done before the deadline. And so you can imagine if you live in a large city, every building that has windows that need to be washed, there are going to be a number of these on top of the roof. And so there are a tremendous number of these anchorages that have to be inspected. So OSHA issued their guidance that basically said if they inspected a work site and the inspection and certification had not been conducted yet, they would use their enforcement discretion to not issue a citation if the building owner and the employer of any employees there had shown that they were moving toward getting these things done, if they'd contacted the inspectors. I mean, they're really looking for a good faith effort there. So if you have these permanent anchorages and have not had them inspected or certified yet, there's still hope. You may, if you have an OSHA inspection tomorrow, you may not get cited, but the inspector will really be looking for those good faith efforts to comply. The last three bullets here all relate to those, the fall protection and ladder safety systems already addressed. So if you're wanting to get any cages or wells installed and rely on those as your fall protection, you've got about 2 months to get that installed, and then from there on out, any new or replaced fixed ladders over 24 feet, you'll need a ladder safety system or personal fall arrest system. Moving on to the next slide, something that's come up generally here has been grandfathering. We get a lot of questions about when is grandfathering allowed, when is it not allowed. We've tried to pile everything here onto this slide and make it a little easier to comprehend. We have a consistency problem here in the standard. OSHA is working to address it in some areas, but not necessarily in all. So what are the contexts where grandfathering is allowed? It is allowed for the construction of stairs. So if you have stairs that were built before the effective date of the standard, January 2017, then you're okay. You don't have to replace those stairs with stairs that fit the new criteria. Stair rail height also grandfathered in. So as long as your stair rails were in compliance with the old rule and they were installed before the effective date of the new rule, you're fine. Same for fall protection for fixed ladders. As previously discussed, you're grandfathered on those existing fixed ladders up through 2036. There is not a time limit on those, the construction of stairs or stair rail heights. So those you're good for the life of the existing equipment. All right, so we know grandfathering is allowed there. Grandfathering is sort of inexplicably not allowed for guardrail height, and this is addressed in the preamble. So OSHA was very clear in the preamble that they were not going to grandfather guardrails that were installed under previous OSHA guidance. There was, you recall, the long history of getting these updates to the walking working surfaces standard. In the course of issuing those proposed rules, there were time periods where OSHA essentially endorsed guardrails as short as 36 inches. And so there exist a number of facilities out there that have guardrails installed that are below 39, probably above 36, but below 39. And under the previous rules, that was fine. In the preamble to this rule, OSHA made it very clear that those are not grandfathered in. So you may have a guardrail that is 38 inches tall, and it was installed in the 70s or 80s. You are legally obligated to tear that out, replace it with a new one, bolster it, raise the height somehow. You are required, and OSHA's been very clear in their guidance that is required, that kind of replacement. We might hope that they would issue an interpretation letter that would reverse that. They may be somewhat boxed in by their language in the preamble when they've spoken that clearly. It's an open question on whether just a simple interpretation letter could change that. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and if you have any enforcement activities against you, it might be something that you can raise if that issue comes up. Two other categories where it's unclear whether grandfathering is allowed: ladders. The dimensions mentioned earlier, it used to have a maximum rung distance of 12 inches. Now it's a range of 10 to 16 inches. As far as we can tell, if you have a 9-inch distance between your rungs, even though that would have been permissible under the old standard, that is impermissible now, and you need to tear that ladder out and replace it. Same issue for step bolts. There are some minor differences there. As far as we can tell, grandfathering is not allowed. There is a request for interpretation out there now to allow those dimensions to be grandfathered in, but so far we haven't seen anything back on that. All right, last thing here under other notable issues is legal challenges. For a new rule, this actually drew very few legal challenges. We've listed them here because you may have seen something about them in the press. We dealt with window cleaners and chimney sweeps were really the focus, and then also gutter cleaning. So the complaints were that the 300-foot limit on rope systems might cause a problem for window cleaners. That case was voluntarily dismissed by the petitioner, so that situation seems to be resolved. In the chimney sweep and gutter cleaning litigation, that has been on hold for quite a while now. The filings in that case seem to indicate that OSHA and these companies are working together. The real concern there were the prohibitions on people carrying things up ladders and how that would affect their work. We think that will be resolved, and once that's done, it seems that there's no other ongoing litigation related to this new rule. So, fairly unusual situation for a new rule issued by OSHA.
All right, finally, we're going to touch briefly on the guidance and interpretation letters that have come out since the rule was promulgated, and some of the anticipated guidance and interpretation letters that you can expect in your future. So first, we're going to start with the July 19th, 2017 interpretation letter to the International Liquid Terminals Association. And there were two key questions that were asked. You can see them on the slides here. First, Section 1910.25 C5 that provides that the 9.5-inch riser height and tread depth requirements do not apply to stairs installed before January 17th, 2017. And OSHA basically furthered that interpretation to state that it doesn't apply to stairs that were fabricated but not yet installed before that date as well, so long as they meet the exception in C5, 1910.25 C5. The second piece there, under previous standards, under the previous walking working surface standard, stairs with handrails that doubled as stair rails could have had a rail height anywhere between 30 to 34 inches. The final rule did not affect the existing stair rail system requirements, but the final rule did specify that a stair rail system installed before January 17, 2017 can serve as a handrail only when the stair rail height is 36 to 38 inches. So there was some confusion of what provision you need to comply with if the stair rail doubled as a handrail. So OSHA clarified that 1910.29 does not require employers to replace those rails that were installed and in compliance with the prior rule. In other words, there's no need to run out and replace those rails. The next one, August 18, 2017, an interpretation letter was issued to the National Association of Tower Erectors, and there was a number of requests in this that were addressed in this interpretation letter, and almost all of them were denied. And those included requests for additional time to train workers on fall hazards and fall protection equipment. There's already an extension to allow employers to satisfy that requirement to May 17, 2017. They also denied a request for additional time to provide fall protection equipment on fixed ladders extending more than 24 feet. So Mike has already covered that. Just a reminder that you need cage wells, ladders, a safety system, or a personal fall arrest system on those ladders prior to November 18, 2018. They denied a request to exempt telecommunications tower industry from the 300-foot climbing limit for RDSs, rope descent systems. Denied a request to raise trigger for fall protection in the general industry to match the 6-foot trigger in the construction industry. It's always been 4 feet in the ANSI standard since 1932, and OSHA wasn't going to be changing that. And finally, they denied a request to withdraw the exemption for fall protection for pre-work and post-work inspections and assessments, and that's consistent with the construction standard. The one thing that they did change, or promised to change, that is they promised to publish a technical amendment to the rule requiring or correcting 1910.140 C8. So it's consistent with the ANSI standard, the ANSI requirements for testing the gate strength of snap hooks and carabiners.
All right, the last little bit on guidance and interpretation. We've already covered the enforcement guidance for rope descent systems. There are a few other things in the pipeline related to interpretations. We've heard from OSHA that there have been numerous requests for interpretations. We've worked with a few employers and trade associations on submitting a few of those ourselves. So we know OSHA's got a bit of a backlog on requests for interpretation that they need to get out there. We're also anticipating that OSHA is going to issue a compliance directive. That'll be very useful in sort of seeing how OSHA is going to expect their compliance officers to look into these things. OSHA has issued their frequently asked questions, and we'll see there's a few notable things there. If you can go to the next slide. The frequently asked questions, if OSHA covered the topic you're interested in, there's some good guidance there. But what they covered is a very limited subset of the topics. So we've highlighted a couple things here. The first one is related to ladders and fall arrest ladder safety systems. There's a little clarification here on what to do if there is a ladder with multiple sections or connected things where some part of it may be less than 24 feet, but the whole thing is more than 24 feet. OSHA clarified that they would expect there to be a ladder safety system that covers the entire the entirety of that ladder. So if you have those odd configurations, that may be something to keep an eye on. I would flag, though, that should not apply to ladders that are separated by some distance. So if you have a ladder to one level, some offset, so then a ladder to the next level, so that the fall would, if someone fell from that second ladder, they would not fall all the way to the ground. This particular interpretation shouldn't apply there. So you'll have to keep an eye on your very specific factual circumstances in looking at this and reading that interpretation. Otherwise, there's some guidance there on the inspection and assessment, the conditions to which it applies or doesn't. Here, basically, if you've got someone going up to do an inspection, like you have a security guard going up to a low slope roof to do some kind of inspection, that's not the kind of inspection that OSHA was talking about here. The inspections that exception is really meant to apply to was you're going up to inspect to determine whether you need fall protection, right? So if you regularly have security guards or other people going up on these low slope roofs to do, quote, an inspection, you do need to treat that as work that's occurring on that low slope roof and address any fall protection requirements that need to be addressed. And then the last one here is the load capacity signage. Dan already addressed this. Even though you don't have to post your load capacity ratings anymore, they will be looking for evidence that you have complied with your maximum intended load. So keep an eye on that one. And that brings us to a close. As we wrap up, I'll just flag that we have a few more webinars this year. Next up is repeat willful and egregious violations, followed by the process safety update. Then also keep an eye on our blog. We update somewhat frequently. We are planning to do an update when we get the the citation data from OSHA for fiscal year 18. We'll be looking to do an update when we get a clear look at what are the real trends from the first full year of enforcement under the new rules. So keep an eye out for that and other updates on our blog. If you're looking for we've got a couple of really good in-person events coming up. September 25th in Chicago, we're having an in-person labor and employment and OSHA briefing. We've got a new office there in Chicago this year. We're excited to have people out and introduce you to the team we've got out there. We'll have some folks from DC up as well. So if you're in the Chicago area or just want to take a trip to Chicago, join us on September the 25th. You can find registration information on our website. And then the last in-person event is our first annual Process Safety Summit coming up here in Washington, D.C. on October the 23rd. We are going to have a full-day program with some agency personnel, some industry representatives. Should be a really good day if you're interested in process safety. we've got a number of trade associations participating as well, so it's going to be a good group. We hope that if you've got a chance to join us, that you will. And I think that's going to bring us to a close.
Yep. So if you have any questions, I know we tried to address some of the questions that were provided in the chat function. But if you have any further detailed questions, feel free to reach out to either Micah or myself, and we'd be happy to answer them. I know that there were some pretty detailed questions in the chat function that we really just didn't get to. We didn't have time. So please, we'll try and respond to those as soon as possible. But also, again, please feel free to reach out to either of us.
Thanks for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of the day.